Welcome to Cover, the World Affairs Councils of America's monthly author series. And I'm not Bill Clifford. He was unable to be here, but I'm Joyce Davis, and I'm president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. And I also have another hat as outreach and opinion editor. We know that is the editorial page editor for Penn Live, the major newspaper in our region of Pennsylvania. I'm happy to serve as your moderator for today's discussion. We are honored to welcome Chandran Nair, founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT, an independent think tank that is based in Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur. Mr. Nair also founded the Other 100, a nonprofit global photojournalism initiative to share the humans behind media stories, and developed as a counterpoint to other lists like Forbes 100 and celebrity lists. He has previously authored Consumptionomics, Asia's Role in Reshaping Capitalism and Saving the Planet, and The Sustainable State, The Future of Government, Economy, and Society. Now, today we're here for a very provocative conversation. We're going to discuss Mr. Nair's most recent book, Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World. Mr. Nair, welcome to Cover. I can't wait to begin the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Well, I think let's get started. We're going to delve into a lot of difficult topics for some people, but let's just let you provide an overview of the issues you raised in your book, Dismantling Global White Privilege.
Thank you, Ms. Davis, and welcome to everyone. It's a great privilege to be here and to have the opportunity to share a few thoughts about the book. So, to your question about what motivated me to drive the book, I've often been asked what was the thrust of the ideas that made me want to write the book, and I often say that that there was no single moment in which I said I got to write this book, or single event. That these issues have been on my mind for the last 20, 30 years. I've had the privilege of working in many parts of the world. And I observe one thing all over that, and I'm going to use the word white people, and not to offend anyone, but I'm always intrigued why it's okay to call other people black people and brown people, and no one gets offended. So if I use the word white people, I hope people don't mind. But how it was that all over the world, I noticed, being also a citizen of a former British colony, that white people always were treated specially and had privileges. Even in today's world where I live in Hong Kong, a white person working there is called an expat. A non-white person might be called a migrant or an immigrant and things like that. And with expat comes the connotations of professionalism, privileges, high earning salaries, and various perks. So I've been noticing this all over for many years. And I most noticed this, of course, when I had the opportunity to live and work in Southern Africa for about 5 years during the anti-apartheid era and got very immersed in much of the anti-apartheid movement. This is before Nelson Mandela was freed, etc. So and I lived in Europe for many years as well, and experienced the sort of usual racism, etc., which, as I describe in the book, is often too much the focus of today's discussions, but more importantly, and particularly the more blatant acts of racism, which I think, racism in all forms exists, not just amongst white people, but exists right across the different races and different nations. But the murder of George Floyd, as many people will know, essentially triggered a global conversation, particularly as particularly as people began to recognize the importance of organizations like Black Lives Matter in the United States. And with that, there was a conversation going back 2 years across the world, which evolved around taking down statues, discussions particularly in the United States and Europe, about recognizing Black people and protest movements like taking a knee, and arguments about why there weren't enough Black people getting awards at the Oscars and the Academies, etc. I found all of these to be rather superficial in the sense that I couldn't be bothered if someone abused me and called me a name. That sort of racism exists all over the world. It's unacceptable, but it's not that as troubling to me as what I noticed, which was essentially the more insidious nature of white power across the world. So as the Black Lives Matter movement caught the attention of the world, and there were protests and etc., I found something quite interesting about it. Much of it was focused on the United States, where Black people are essentially and rightfully fighting for equal rights, looking to essentially not be to take down the systemic racism. And people like me who are made aware of the struggles of Black people going back for 40, 50 years, could identify with this. After all, I read James Baldwin, Aldrich Cleaver, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali. We knew all of these people as our heroes. But I noticed that during the Black Lives Matter movement, the world was captivated by things such as, we should all take a knee, we should take down the statues, and we should rename certain things. And we're kind of looking back. And what I wanted to make clear was that actually, whilst those things are important, those symbols of history, etc., and the present day struggle of Black people, there was actually a much more insidious nature of white privilege, which was woven into the very fabric of globalization. So 20, 30 years of looking at these things sort of came together when I decided that I would write an article to say that as important as Black Lives Matter is, Black Lives Matter is, it is actually the tip of the iceberg of white power. And away from the policeman who had a knee on a Black person, there were very important ways in which white privilege was being preserved. And therefore I wrote the article. My book publisher, who is based in San Francisco, called me up when he read the piece and said, hey, you want to turn this into a book? I had no intention of turning it into a book. And I said, give me a day to think about it. And I thought this was a moment in which what many non-white people around the world know and feel, but no one's captured it in a book. But of course, people know about racial discrimination. I should perhaps try and provide a narrative that allow people to have a constructive discussion about how pervasive it is around the world, beyond images of policemen putting a knee on a Black person and killing them, as obnoxious and tragic and murderous as it is. There were other areas which essentially oppressed millions of people, and that need to be exposed if we were to create a world that was more equitable and in which other races and countries essentially were not dominated and oppressed by this sort of soft power of the West.
Right. Well, frankly, what that knee on the net did was expose the system, the systemic racism, the fact that in broad daylight, a police officer who's trained to serve and to protect did not think he had to protect a Black man. And did not think he had any due. He could kill him in broad daylight. It exposed the system. And I think what you're exposing in your book is the system of Western white domination around the world. But you broke off clear topics. One was how the economic system is being dominated. I mean, you really laid out several issues. So talk about each one of those topics and why you chose that. But then there were some you didn't include in this that are as important, I would say, like religion. So I'm going to wonder if you're going to have a sequel coming. But lay out, what were those topics? I think it was 4 or 5 that you really focused in on.
Yes, thank you. So I actually laid out 9 spheres of globalization to allow people to understand what it looks like. I also made it very clear that the perpetuation of the privilege of white privilege is not simply one of skin color. It's also one of essentially seeking the privileges of white privilege. It's been institutionalized throughout the world. So the nine spheres that I talked about to get people to understand. And my intention was also to edify non-white people around the world, many of whom have become inured to how white privilege works and thinking this is just how the world is. But let's start with the first area of geopolitics.
Yeah.
So I go into geopolitics. It's only America and its European allies who apparently can impose sanctions on other countries and essentially get a free ride around sanctions that essentially kill millions of people. Over the last 30 years, American, US, and European sanctions have killed millions of people around the world, innocent people, by claiming some righteous role in the world to essentially impose what is good and bad and how other countries should essentially behave, and using that as a fig leaf, essentially, for their need to dominate other countries and take down threats. So, for instance, many people, and particularly for Americans, a few Americans, white Americans, and even Black Americans today understand that U.S. sanctions on Iraq have been responsible for the death of about 500,000 children over the last 25 years. There is no outrage. But at the same time, no country can impose sanctions on the United States or anybody else because we don't have any tools, nor is that the way our other countries operate. But at the drop of, at a whim, the United States and the Western allies can impose sanctions on anybody else. That's in the geopolitical area. And there are many other areas where that essentially is practiced. The tensions between the West, led by the United States and China, is another example. And I argue that is the
economic, the global economics is where you're going with that, but that's also dominated and controlled frequently by the Western world. So
that's right. So I say in the book that white privilege is the best way to understand how dominance and oppression by Western cultures globally are perpetuated and promoted between countries and across countries, with the main objective of maintaining economic dominance. So it's an economic argument. When I lived in Southern Africa, I began to understand by having the great privilege of meeting people like Oliver Tambo, Bishop Tutu, etc., that this is not simply a case of black versus white. This is essentially centuries of economic dominance, and the desire to perpetuate and maintain that economic dominance is the very essence of essentially white superiority, the feeling of white superiority, and the desire to use that to maintain those privileges. The other areas I go into then is essentially the area of international business, which is always touted as being one that is devoid of race and all of those things. But people like you and me know that is far from the truth. So I outline how in the so-called, much celebrated globalized world of business, white privilege is entrenched. And so I give examples that, for instance, that the rating agencies of the world are all Western agencies. Apparently, you can't have an African agency to do the ratings of sovereign nations. Apparently, only white people know how to do this. The 4 big accounting firms in the world are all led by white men. They're all in the West. Apparently, no one in Singapore or India knows how to do maths, and you can't trust them to essentially audit a firm, etc. If you wanted to have,
I did find that most surprising. I mean, as someone who doesn't focus on economics, I thought, wow, of course, what that's clearly a domination. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you want to do an IPO of your country, then the legitimacy of your IPO is granted if all the actors, including the lawyers, are Western lawyers. You can't have an Indian lawyer or a Chinese lawyer do all your due diligence because they can't be trusted. So all of that is essentially how the business world, international business world works. The gatekeepers of the international, gatekeepers of access to financial markets are all white organizations. And need I say, the most prominent players in the financial markets, the investment banks, are all Westerners as well, Western banks as well. So you have this entire sort of system of gatekeeping, which decides if a Chinese company, an African company, or an Indonesian company is worthy of access to capital markets and even, in fact, to essentially the listings on stock exchanges, and in fact, even to investment. So that's one area.
And you also
And then
attacked one area of dear to me, media, right? I mean, you also clearly showed how it's the Western perception of the world and of what's happening that also controls thoughts around the world. It controls the mentality of much of the globe.
I think this is very poorly understood by so many people. Someone like me, who's had the opportunity over the last 30 years to immerse myself and be informed around the world. Well, I had only one place to go. It was the Western media, and brought up and colonized the whole issue of mind capture. I'm just as much a victim as that, and I'm not trying to free myself from that. And this book is part of that march to freedom from that capture of my mind. I was brought up in my adult life reading The Economist, the New York Times, the FT. I rarely read any of that anymore, because once you switch on to the biases, it becomes very clear. I've lived in Hong Kong for 25 years, and in the last 10 years, I have seen the almost xenophobic attack on China by supposedly world-class journalists. And I've wondered why that is, and now it's all very clear. The inability of essentially the Western world, led by the United States, to accept the rise of a non-Caucasian civilization for the first time in 400 years. You have to think about it that way. Never before, not in the last 300 years or 400 years, has the Western world had to confront the rise of a non-Caucasian civilization. And what has been very interesting and revealing to me, the allies in the geopolitical sphere of capturing minds, the minds of people like you and me, is essentially through the so-called respected Western media. And they include everything from the BBC to the CNN to the New York Times to all of them. And what has been most interesting for me has been the so-called free press is anything but free. I've been published in the Financial Times, the New York Times, etc. And if I want to get Chandran Nair's name, because I have a bit of a name into the New York Times or the Financial Times, I know what I should say. But if I strike out independently and talk about the views that I have, then it becomes extremely difficult to get in. Slam China, India, etc. I'm in. Praise the United States, and I'm in. Coming from where I am, then I lend credibility to this voice. And what is important in this to understand is many non-white people who don't know better, because of 400 years of domination, our education, etc., seek legitimacy through association with the international sort of so-called pedigree of Western institutions, and that includes the media too.
Well, but it's only natural. But let me ask you this: where, if you do away with the Economist and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, where are you going to go there? Honestly, I mean, because we're still in a world that is very much unfree, that's very much led by despots in many cases. Where are you going to get your news that you really can have some credibility?
Well, that's the crux of the argument that I make, and use the word credible. Well, I don't think the New York Times is credible anymore, given where I am in my head, my worldview. If you have a larger worldview, then you begin to see, well, it's extremely well written. We're all seduced by the reputations of commentators and the language and the perceived insights. But if you have, and I'm not claiming to be the most well-traveled or most knowledgeable, but if you have insights into the world, then I don't see these guys as being credible at all. They have a political agenda, they have an audience, and I know, and I can't mention, but some of the most famous columnists in the New York Times, at least two of them have told me, on a political level, they agree with what I'm saying, but they can't write it. Something has to pay for the rent. So where do we go for? I still read The Economist sometimes, but I find it, I cringe at the narratives, knowing what I know. I read sometimes the Financial Times, but I don't take an opinion away from that. As they say quite often, it's important to know what the other side your
Same.
enemy is thinking, to be able to counter it. So I have actually pushed, and this is the last point I want to make on this. I have pushed in this part of the world and in my book for the non-white world to essentially start investing in its media groups and to create that. We need different groups. Even my book, whether the book is well known will depend on some white editor deciding whether we will review the book, whether we will put it on on a list, and all of these are controlled. And thus, I won't go into the details, but to even get onto the New York Times bestsellers list, it's dominated by essentially what Americans think, not what others think. And pre-sales depend on what Americans think rather than that. So you get the bestsellers list dominated by American writers. You would think people around the world don't write books.
Right. Well, the other issue we have to talk to this before I get to some of the questions, though. The other issue you bring up that is a hot button issue in the United States, too, is education. Yes. I mean, now there's a raging battle on what I want my kids to learn and how the history is going to be taught. And I personally, before I started traveling and seeing the world, thought I was relatively well educated, and then realized I hadn't read a single Eastern author. I knew nothing about a lot of history, Ibn Battuta and all of those, nothing at all about any of these folks. And yet we can graduate from places like Harvard and not be exposed to thinking outside of the Western sphere.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Black poet and singer Gil Scott-Heron said that's why it's called his story. This version ain't mine. And I quote Gil Scott in one of the chapters. History is essentially so important. I've been asked this as well, particularly in the context of critical race theory debate in the US. And I've tried not to delve into it. I think I dedicated half a page to that and saying, but that discussion is pertinent in the American context, but the rest of us, and when I used to go to the United States and Europe, I was staggered by how much more of the world and history I knew, even coming from a colony without privileges. I didn't go to the best schools in the world, but we knew so much about the world. And when I went to Europe, and particularly when I go to the US, I'm staggered by how little people know and how narrow their perspectives. Part of the perspectives is clouded by the media obsessions with essentially America is number one and we understand the world. No understanding of what's going on in the rest of the world. I work in the field of sustainability and geopolitics and the stuff like that. And it staggers me how little people know. And I've had the opportunity to debate and be on panels with quite prominent Americans. And it's quite easy to expose their ignorance about many of these things. So the learning of history is such an important thing. And when I speak to Americans about what happened in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and Laos, they don't even seem to understand the scale. All they remember is that, we have heroes. But I remind Americans that 3 million Vietnamese died compared to 50,000 US soldiers, all tragic, we all know. Wars are bad. They have no sense of understanding that more bombs were dropped by the Americans in Laos, a small country, which till today, bears the wounds of unexploded bombs across the countryside. That more bombs were dropped in Laos in the entire Second World War in Europe. People are staggered. But what is also interesting to your point about history, most history books are written by Western publications, Western authors. So it's my version, not yours. And so even in Southeast Asia, a whole generation of young Asians, the millennials, have no idea what happened, not 500 years ago or 400 years ago, what happened 45 years ago in their neighborhood. They have no understanding. This has all been wiped out. And so I'm very clear that this generation of more informed and educated Asians must understand what happened so that we don't make the same mistakes and we understand where these countries are coming from.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn now to some questions that have come in advance, and I'm going to go to one of the most provocative ones. So this will probably be your hardest question, all right? What is the author's response to white people have brought so much good to the world, white people deserve privilege?
Well, that's my response is very simple. When white people, or any people, have brought so much good to the world, then they deserve recognition. Privilege is something that one uses not to maintain and perpetuate hegemony and economic superiority or others, which also does severe harm. All I'm talking about in my book is the entrenched systemic perpetuation of privilege by one race and a cabal of Western countries to essentially maintain a hegemony that does harm to a whole host of people. I could also argue, and to the person who described, who said white people brought a lot of good to the world, that's a very narrow and unsophisticated view of how the world operates. If you think that the British Empire brought a great deal of good to Africa, I would recommend several books. But perhaps one of the best books to read that recently came out, and I think it's 6-7 years ago. It's written by the former Undersecretary for the United Nations, Shashi Tharoor, the way he dismantles this idea with evidence and going back into history to look at these things around the British Empire in the UK, in India. It's called the Inglorious Empire. And I think the view that many hold that white people went around the world doing good is a very unsophisticated understanding. That doesn't mean that white people went around the world to essentially did just harm. But the evidence is very clear in Africa, etc. You know, the Belgians didn't go to Congo to fraternize with Black people. They went there to rape and plunder. You can't call that good. The British didn't go to India because they wanted to drink masala chai and tikka. They went there to plunder. In that process, they built some infrastructure, and the book explains very clearly much of that infrastructure was built to essentially extract the wealth out of India, and the numbers are given very clearly. But I will accept that where good was done, we should acknowledge it, and that not all of it is bad. But the evidence, the historic evidence that is coming out is that it destroyed civilizations everywhere. And in modern day, white people didn't do good in Iraq. They destroyed it.
All right, well, we have a question from Madeline who asks, do you believe this new generation is interested in changing the status quo? Now, I would simply add, I'm not sure which generation and where she's talking about, because I'm sure generations or young people in Asia maybe have a different perspective than some in the United States, but go ahead, tackle that question.
I think I think there is an element of the younger generation who do want to change things. And it was essentially one of the catalysts for me writing that article and then taking on the book. I felt for the first time there was an opening, a moment in which there are enough people in the Western world, younger people, who said, hey, tell me, what does this look like? Because at the same time as the Black Lives Movement was essentially triggering a response in many parts of Europe and the United States, I felt that this was a moment which young people were saying, hey, we all want to go and protest. But at the same time, I thought they were protesting at a superficial level. I'm going to support the Black athlete taking a knee. I'm going to, of course, oppose police brutality. But were they willing to essentially look beyond this flagrant sort of acts of violence or racism and look at essentially how their privileges were essentially derived and how they are maintained? And I think this generation has a chance, but it has to have the very difficult conversations that I think my book sort of outlines, and it gets them to look into it much more clearly. I think the challenge will be when these same young people essentially enter the world of business, politics, and globalization, and understand that if they are to tackle this, they're going to have to give up a whole host of privileges, and that becomes difficult. Now, in the non-Western world, the reason I wrote the book was to give young people a narrative around which not to cast, not to throw bombs at other people and get angry, but to have a constructive narrative, because we do need to build a world around which that the past inequalities and the privileges that white people enjoy till today in different parts of the world are dismantled in ways that are essentially constructive and help us to live together in ways that allow for a greater equity and fairness.
But you raised the point that I think is really, really important for us to comprehend. I see here someone pointing out that their heart is broken by this. They hate even this kind of conversation and how much they revere other cultures. But the issue you just raised is it's not just a question of having a soft heart, compassion, or sympathy. It's
That's
whether
right.
your bottom line will change. And are you willing to? You've just spoken, a system that privileged one group of people was built on the backs of others around the world. To change it means you're going to lose a little bit of something, something. Are you willing to do that?
Yeah, I think that comment that my heart is broken listening to this because I have compassion.
Yep.
Well, everyone, lots of people have compassion, but it's quite easy to have compassion when you have privileges. It's that same thing that and it's a difficult thing to say, but I felt I should say it in the chapter where I talk about the white savior mentality. We care and we are going to go out. But the fact that so many of the champions of good causes are white people should remind us that it comes with privilege. The ability to then showcase this ability to go out and do things. So two things come to my mind. You got to ask yourself, why is it that there aren't more prominent non-white people around the world showcased as the do-gooders, those who go out to the world and do things? Part of it is, of course, they come first from systems that have been brutalized, that they haven't reached that levels in their societies where they can go out. For instance, most people in the Western world think that Chinese people don't care about anything, and they're uncivilized, and they're some communist regime in which people essentially fight for scraps, and there is no sense of humanity, etc. This is so wrong. The Chinese government is probably one of the largest players in the medical area field in Africa. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of Chinese doctors operate right across the African system, but this is never spoken about because the media doesn't want to portray Chinese or others as essentially people who with compassion too. So that's one point. But the other point really is about we can't express compassion when we have so much, and we should all do, but that compassion quite often is also a camouflage for essentially hiding away privileges that are so entrenched that allow us to act in certain ways. So I'm not ever going to suggest that people should not show compassion, but the point of my book is to make clear that it is not about individuals sharing compassion. Where is the compassion in the United States when the US government drops bombs on countries indiscriminately and imposes sanctions? Where is white America in terms of not protesting against the brutality of war that is essentially waged by the United States, has been waged for almost 95% of the time of the existence of the United States? There doesn't seem to be that, because the patriotic response is, we are good people, and when we exercise military power, we have a right to do that because we know what's good and bad. So it's beyond this individual compassion.
So we get it's a system. It's not it's the whole thing has to be dismantled. But one of the questions that's asked here is, what can organizations like the G7, the non-aligned movements, the BRICS nations, are there any international organizations that get this and that are moving to try to begin this dismantling, or that have the power to do so?
There are very few. The most powerful organizations are essentially Western-led.
Right.
Let's be very clear about this, right? The G7 is essentially, and I wrote a piece about it, when the G7 or the G8 met. It used to be the G8, if you all remember. And then, the Western powers decide we're going to take someone out. It used to be the G20, and now I think they're deciding they're going to take somebody else out because they don't go with the flow of the Western ideological interpretation of geopolitics and all of that. So these countries can do something, but the G8, for instance, on the economic front, could do a whole host of things to bring about change in terms of some of the rules of globalization. But the point I try and make is much of the rules of globalization have been written to essentially benefit the victors of the Second World War. And when the G8 and the G20 and the Western organizations like the OECD talk about the rules-based order, people like me just chuckle, because the rules-based order was not written by people like me, and it was not at all. So when the rest of the world, which is 85%, by the way, 85% of the world, or a bit more, is non-Western, non-white, we don't have a say. And so when we want to have a say, be it the Chinese today or the Indians in 20 years' time, we are apparently a threat through the rules-based order. The rules-based order is essentially one that perpetuates systems that benefit Western powers, not the rest of us. And therein lies the tensions of today. So what is happening is there is no organization that I know that is even having this discussion. And I do in my book say what these sorts of organizations need to start doing. But it's very difficult. And therefore, what's happening is the non-Western world is beginning to essentially push and push. And in an earlier conversation today, I did something with a group of investors in Europe. I was asked, do you think this will change? And my response is, it will change if the Western world is willing to accept a post-Western world in which there is greater equity. And if it doesn't, then the push will come from outside. It will take longer, and there'll be greater tensions. The trade wars that Donald Trump and others, and a so-called, we thought, a more enlightened democratic president may change, as all symbols of this inability to accept sharing power with another rising nation. So therein lies those difficulties, but it will come as others become stronger.
Well, it will come as others become stronger, but power doesn't generally give itself up without a real fight. And
absolutely. And that's what we're seeing in the world. The United States today, in many ways, is the bastion of essentially white power around the world. And I've got a piece coming out next week using the Ukraine, the sad events in Ukraine, to essentially say the Europeans brought this upon themselves. They essentially outsourced their security and therefore their power to the United States, which is the most militaristic nation in the world. And therefore they essentially took foreign policy directives from the United States, who so see Russia as an enemy, Cold War mentality. And the Europeans, if they had if they had leadership, would have done something different. So the United States today is essentially the leader of white power throughout the world. The Europeans and tiny nations like Australians or white settler communities all come together. For people who are non-white looking at the world, it's so crystal clear. There is essentially a white tribe. At the apex of that white tribe is the Anglosphere. The United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. No one would care about Australia, a country with 20 million people, if not for the fact that there were Anglo-Saxon dominated white settlers. Nobody would care about them.
And yet we were talking a little bit before, and we're going to get into some inside baseball here, because while you're talking about white privilege, you're also talking about Western privilege.
Yes.
And you're also talking about Black Americans being the beneficiaries of some of that, even though oppressed inside.
Yes.
Many of us who are in the global arena realize that we bring that white Western privilege with us as well. How
That's
do you
right.
deal with that?
Well, I'm glad you talked about that, because about a couple of months ago, I was invited to address a Black audience out of New York, which was essentially an activist movement, which is talking about the future of Black lives in the United States. And I said that they wanted to talk about my book, but I said that one of the things that is so interesting And whilst the Black Lives Matter movement is so important, one of the shifts in Black America has been the lack of truly international spokespeople, Black leaders who essentially sought solidarity with the rest of the world. And part of the shift, in my view, was because white power had become so powerful in the United States, both in business and politics, that even Black leaders found that they had to essentially play the game. So the point I was trying to make there is, while I totally support the Black Lives Matter movement, how could you not? What was Black America's view? What is Black America's view about seeking equality with white America, when white America is essentially the global hegemon and essentially the most destructive and belligerent nation in the world? So is Black America essentially saying we want to be equal as whites? So because by having equality with white people and therefore the economic access, etc., which is their right, but that power, that economic opportunities, etc., come from America's global domination and its relentless pursuit and maintaining that order for its economic benefit. In that way, therefore, Black Americans are essentially the beneficiaries of white power throughout the world. And one of the things I joke about is that I say I love Donald Trump, because this guy at least spoke the truth. He said, we're white, we're number one. The others just said, we know we're number one. We don't have to say it. But at least Donald Trump went out there and said, we're white and we're number one. And God forbid if anyone disagrees with us. So, so Black America needs to choose. For the rest of us, when we listen to people like Malcolm X and we'd read all that stuff, there was an era of Black leaders who essentially had solidarity with us. Muhammad Ali famously said, and it changed my life, I remember, as a young kid in Southeast Asia, where everything was about the disastrous Vietnam War. We didn't know enough. We were told by the Voice of America that apparently the nasty commies are coming, those yellow people. And we were all talking about the media, basically brainwashed into believing this. This is the power of the Western media. Muhammad Ali turned up for a fight in Kuala Lumpur, where I am today, and said, I got no fight with the yellow man. And then, as you know, I think at that time, Muhammad Ali and Mao Zedong were the two most famous human beings on the planet before the internet and anything else, the two most famous people. And Muhammad Ali gave up fame and fortune and spent 3 years in jail for a principle. And many of us could identify with that. Today, I don't see any Black American leader of global repute who's even dare say that, because if the troops go to war, we all better support, because otherwise we're unpatriotic, and therein lies this desire to cling on to white power.
Well, see that, I mean, that's a whole nother, we're going to bring you back to talk Black talk here, but that's a whole nother thing, because the question is, as Blacks get power, or as minorities in this country get power, will that even change anything as we relate to the world, if we're still in the mindset of the global white Western privilege? We're right. Trying to be that, right?
That's right.
So, all right.
And most of the world is as well, which is what I say about
exactly.
Because of 400 years, we all want to be white because that's the way you get access to power. Proximity to power is being more white. Dress in a dashiki or a sari or some traditional outfit, you can't walk into Goldman Sachs in New York. You look like, hey, who is this person coming in here? So, we conform. I talk about fashion, that women in the non-Western world have to all conform to dress like Westerners. You can't dress in your own way. We have to speak in a certain way. I'm a victim of that. But I can go two ways. So if
me
you might
too.
listen, yeah. So if you listen to me speaking at home, you won't understand me because I speak in different patios, etc. But to be legitimate at this platform, I have to speak the language of the white person too.
I hear you.
That isn't a problem with that, but you hear what I'm saying.
I absolutely understand what you're saying, but let me take this, because this will get us to the crux of what we need to talk about. Michael is asking, what is the suggested or intended social structure? What does it look like once this prevalent white privilege model is dismantled? What do you see as the utopia?
Well, what I see as the utopia, maybe let me start with something trivial.
Okay.
I walk into the airport at Hong Kong. I'm dressed casually, and because I travel so frequently, I'm a privilege. You know, I'm one of those frequent travelers. I check in at first class, etc. I will not be asked, "Are you at the right counter?" Whereas I've seen white people who are not even top tier travelers walk and they never get questioned. So it's just trivia. But someone like me who travels all around the world, we see it. What it means is it's a world in which house prices in Singapore don't go soaring and get distorted because expatriates from multinational companies move in and are essentially paid hefty wages and essentially given perks that even distort the housing market. That executives from the West do not come to Asia and I get paid 3 times as much as the average, or even more than the average Asian doing the same job because they're white. That's I say it's partly trivia, but that is what it is. But what it looks like is one in which the United States and its white allies cannot use the dollar, cannot weaponize the global reserve currency. The US dollar does not belong to the USA. It was a global bargain. And the bargain was very clear. We'd use it as a tradable, essentially currency, but you cannot weaponize it. And they have weaponized it. And because they have weaponized it, they have been able to dictate what is right and wrong and punish people. Maybe trivia, but again, coming back to it, the rules of sports would also not be affected and dominated by white people. I'll give you another example in the book I cite. There's something like 34 international sporting associations that essentially dictate the framing and the rules of the Olympics and sports. Only one of them is based in Asia. The rest of them all based in the West. What does that mean? The rules are set by Western, essentially, organizations. They decide which event gets more medals. Swimming has had more and more events added to it, mainly because it's always dominated by Western powers. Australia has a disproportionate amount of medals in swimming because it has a say in how many events. Cycling. Well, you know, how many African countries have a velodrome? Why would you add that? Can we add a lot more long distance running to that so that Kenyans and Ethiopians may win some stuff? So there's a huge amount of things. So the world will look very different in terms of we would have not 3 rating agencies run by white people, but we might have 10. And they would be proportionally representative of the world. We will not have 4 accounting firms that dictate whether you're legitimate or not. We would have 15. The G8 could mandate that and say within the next 10 years, we're essentially going to bring in firms from Japan, Korea, they all have to be high standards, but they will not be dominated by Western people. So there's a whole host of things that I talk about in the book. The world will look very different. And, you know, white people don't get a free pass to dictate how I live.
And clearly, the UN Security Council might look a little differently. One would think.
Absolutely, absolutely. It would look very different. It would be good to have India, which would be the most populous nation on the planet within about the next 20 years on the UN Security Council, and not have puny UK, which is not even a state in terms of population in India. But there you go.
All right. Well, in taking this to this level of, you know, what are we doing about it? And in defense of my country, we have started a serious conversation about dismantling white privilege and systemic. I mean, I have heard people say systemic racism who I never thought would ever utter the word racism. I mean, and there are lots of things going on in corporations, training people in diversity and inclusion, opening people's mind. I just sat through another one to help about implicit bias. Clearly, this is something that also could help globally. It won't solve the problem, but it begins with the mind, knowing there is a problem. And one of the questions say, is there as much resistance to the reality of white privilege in other parts of the world as there was here in the United States? Or as there is here? We're just trying, some of us are tackling it.
So yeah, there's a couple of very interesting points to make. Let me start with the point about there's huge, widespread. It's so interesting to me that as soon as I wrote the book, even though the nature of the pandemic and getting books across the world is much more difficult than it was 2 years ago, there's huge amount of support. I've had people from Africa and different parts of the world write and say, hey, finally, these are things that I felt. I didn't know how to even articulate this. And you put this together and put it in a way that we can have it intelligent and constructive. Because my intention is not to be divisive. This is very important. That's why it's called a post-equity equity in a post-Western world. The equity issue is very important to me. So in the non-Western world, this issue is so well understood. But at the same time, I want to say that whilst I say that institutional racism in the United States is something that we're all shocked by, I also make it very clear in the book that all the ills of the world are not due to white privilege. I come from a part of the world there's great incompetence, there's different forms of racism, corruption, etc. That's not what I'm writing about. In this particular issue, I'm writing about what I identified and I observed through the privilege I've had of working in different parts of the world. So it's not born out of an academic understanding, it's born out of life experience. So that life experience tells me that there are many ills in the world that are not related necessarily to white privilege. But white privilege is so dominant in the way it influences the way geopolitics, the economy, and the capture of mind operates, that it has to be dismantled at the same time as we correct other things in the non-Western world. So to your point about in the United States, these things are taking place, it's great. My point is that, and in the discussion I had earlier today, people said, hey, what about, the diversity and inclusion, and we have Indians running, Microsoft and Google and things. I said, that is not the point I'm trying to make. The fact that there are few elites, Indians and Chinese or Black Africans, that is also quite clearly used as a camouflage to essentially say, hey, we're open, we have all these people. But where does the power lie? Google's power doesn't lie with the CEO. He's an administrator of essentially a company with essentially huge global impact, but is essentially part of that system as well, right? So is Facebook. So whilst it's important we have these diversity and inclusion sort of discussions, they don't actually shift the power relationship. And I will go on, as I argue in the book, that many non-whites who are educated and elite seek whiteness. Seek whiteness. This includes Black people, but this includes people around the world. Why? Because the entire education system, 400 years, I was taught Shakespeare. I had no clue what this guy was talking about. He talked about the meadows, and there I am in the rainforest of Malaysia, not understanding what the hell a meadow means. Yet I was told that literature is Shakespeare. Literature was not about Rabindranath Tagore or other Arab writers. It was nothing to do with that, because the whole purpose was to get a young mind like me to understand that literature, language was the English language, and that if you're sophisticated, you absorb that, you don't absorb anything else. So in the same way, when we look at these things, we have to understand that when diversity and inclusion is celebrated, it's a good thing, but it's actually just a veneer. The real power is what we're talking about. And I gave an example, if you give me 30 seconds, I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago that an Indian woman was essentially named as the new CEO of Louis Vuitton, the fashion company, and was celebrated as a big success. And I wrote a piece basically saying, here we go again. By diversity and inclusion is camouflage for essentially perpetuating essentially white fashion sensibilities and sense of beauty. That has nothing to do with essentially being Black, brown, etc. And that so long as you buy Hermes and you buy Louis Vuitton, you are essentially sophisticated. But what have you bought into? You have bought into white culture. It's not bad. I'm not saying that French fashion is bad, but the power of that is a lot more insidious because it's essentially starts to erode other cultures. And I remember sitting on a panel once, I think it was in Europe, with a senior executive of Hermes. who was lamenting the fact that Hermes could not essentially break into the Indian market because Indian women apparently still wanted to wear the sari. Do I need to explain any more?
Right, right. Well, as we end, as we close, I'm going to say just my own opinion here that as much as it is absolutely correct, I don't have any argument with you, but we have still come a long way. We would not have been able to have this conversation with the World Affairs Councils of America, maybe even 10 years ago. I'm just saying. And I wouldn't have been here to talk to you about it. So
well, let me say that, you know, everything I've said here in the short discussion to make the point, but let me also make it very clear that I see great progress around the world, but the amount of work we have to do is huge. And therefore, you are absolutely right to remind the audience and remind me that there has been great progress. And I am not in any way attempting to demote or decry the efforts that have been made by lots of people. I'm just attempting to essentially give people a wider perspective, if that doesn't sound arrogant.
Well, it doesn't sound arrogant. In fact, I think you're starting a global dialogue, and one that in the United States, at least among African American communities and Latino communities, we will help perpetuate. We will get this word out and start that dialogue, because you're right. We have to all be in this together. And it's about opening the mind to different ideas, all of which should have power and should have an ability to at least compete equally. So if you have some final words to share with us, one person did ask, how's your book doing in the East as opposed to the West?
The book is doing very well and very popular in this part of the world. It could do better in the Western world. I have even good Western friends who've asked me in leading positions who said, but Chandran, why did you have to write the book? Almost as if I had betrayed the tribe, because I was seen as someone who had, you know, bought into the system. The last thing I want to say is I want to make it very clear to everyone that this is not an anti-white or anti-Western narrative. That is too simplistic. I am not anti-white. I have many white friends, although that sounds a terrible thing to say. I work with many organizations around the world, but I felt, and it took me a while to get the courage to actually put this book out and call it what it is. And it has resonated with many people around the world. It is a difficult conversation. It's even difficult for people like me to speak about it, given where I come from. So I want to make it very clear. This is not an anti-white or a rant against Western nations, etc. This is essentially a discussion about where power has concentrated itself over the last 400 years. And in the 21st century, it cannot be like this, and we have to change that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to give a virtual hand clap to you to thank you for being here with us and to thank our audience for those provocative questions. We really, really appreciate your tuning in to this most important conversation. This is the beginning of a very serious global dialogue about Western white privilege that, as our author says, we have to look to dismantle for equity and equality around the globe.